You all know Richard Moffey and Hal Cohen, and I know you know Commissioner Iacoboni. I'm delighted that they've joined us. Before we answer any questions on the current issues of the day, we wanted to bring you up to speed on one of the challenges that we're facing together in Vermont, which is the tenuous funding of the program that keeps our most vulnerable Vermonters warm in wintertime, and that is the LIHEAP program. And we want to bring you up to date on recent developments. This is a matter that I'm extraordinarily concerned about, that I know that Vermonters are concerned about, at a time when oil prices are pushing $4 a gallon, which is roughly 40 cents higher than the average last year at this time. Washington is threatening to drastically reduce the funding for our most vulnerable Vermonters, seniors, and others who we need to keep warm this winter. Last Friday, HHS announced that LIHEAP funds will be available, but only at the budget level that was originally proposed by the White House. And there was some conversations between governors and the White House. The White House is reconsidering that number, but the White House is, for whatever reason, HHS is sticking with their original number that they introduced to Congress. So what does that mean for Vermont? Vermont is sending out $13.5 million in LIHEAP funding right away in mid-November. I've authorized us to send out $13.5 million immediately because Vermonters need oil now and they need heat now. We're going to assume that we're going to get the $11 million from Congress, which is basically what the President's number would give us, and we're going to transfer $2.5 million from the Weatherization Trust Fund to enable low-income Vermonters to get one fuel delivery right now while we fight for more funding in Washington. So we have authorized that. It will happen. We're borrowing the money from the Weatherization Trust Fund. The obvious question is going to be from you, does that mean that Weatherization Trust Fund work cannot continue? No, it does not. We assume that we'll be able to repay that money when Washington does the right thing, but it wouldn't affect any projects before next spring. So that's why we're choosing to take the $2.5 million from that source. I want to walk you through the various options of where we are so that you can understand the math on how this works. And behind Hal is a chart that kind of lays it out for you. But to put it in plain English, the Obama budget proposal would drop us at current prices to a total of 96 gallons of oil being delivered to Vermonters this winter. Obviously, that's not going to keep 18,000 vulnerable Vermonters warm. The House budget is somewhat better than the Obama administration's proposal. That would bring us to 172 gallons if the House number prevailed. And the Senate budget is the best, and it would bring us to 192 gallons of oil this winter. That's versus last winter's allocation, getting the average recipient 262 gallons. So that's the challenge that we face in real oil to real Vermonters who need help. It's worth mentioning that our congressional delegation, Senator Leahy, Senator Sanders, Congressman Welch, are working tirelessly to get us the Senate number, which would be 192 gallons. They are doing a great job, and I'm incredibly grateful to them for all of their hard work. I should also tell you that we are leading an effort right now among the New England governors to send a clear bipartisan message to Congress that this would be a disaster for Vermont. And we're going beyond New England. I just got off the phone with Governor O'Malley of Maryland. He's very concerned about this. He's going to join us in urging to at least get in a continuing resolution the Senate number from Congress. Just got off the phone with Governor Deval Patrick from Massachusetts. He's very much involved, and the New England governor is going to be putting together a letter under his leadership. I just got off the phone with Link Chafee, Rhode Island. He's very concerned. And Governor Malloy of Connecticut, who's dealing with blizzard problems. He still has 500,000 Connecticut residents without power, but he's devoting some energy to this one as well. Governor Cuomo is also very supportive. Is going to be sending a statement to help us out, as is Governor LePage of Maine and Governor Quinn of Illinois. We have a call into Governor Lynch, and we suspect he shares our concern. So here's the message. We're not going to let Vermonters freeze in their homes this winter, but we need Congress's help. And it is absolutely unacceptable that to contemplate that we would see the kind of reduction to Vermonters when it's cold, when we need to keep them warm, that's being contemplated by Washington at this time. The Obama budget would drop us from last year's number by $11.7 million. We had $23 million last year. His number would cut us to $11.7 million. The House budget would result in a $4 million cut to Vermonters, and the Senate budget would result in a $2.7 million cut. So the stakes are high. This transcends party, it transcends partisanship, and I intend to do everything that I can as governor with my administration, working together with legislative leadership and with our extraordinary congressional delegation to ensure that no Vermonter goes cold this winter and that we get as much resources as we can to ensure that the successful LIHEAP program, which is already underfunded, gets the dollars it needs to keep Vermonters out of harm's way in the cold weather. I want to turn it over just very briefly to both Richard and Hal. Hal Cohen, as you know, is from Central Vermont Community Action, does an extraordinary job there. I'll let him go first, and then Richard.
Thank you, Governor. Just to give you an idea of what's happening on the ground, what I'm hearing from my colleagues from the other community action agencies across the state is we're getting on average over 100 phone calls a day. So the situation is already critical. People are already out of fuel. We have just in the Barre and Montpelier area alone, 100 families are without fuel. What we've heard is happening is that people right now are selling personal goods to get fuel money. They're withholding rent. They're buying less food. They're doing everything possible to get some fuel in their tanks. The other area that we're very concerned about is with a smaller LIHEAP allocation, where we're concerned that we'll be out of money in early January. Last year, we generally peak sometime in January and then have enough funds to get through the rest of the year. With these reduced allocations, we expect we'll peak in December and be out of fuel totally in the state, including crisis fuel, in early January. So it's a very critical situation for families. Thank you.
Richard Muff.
Thank you, Governor. And I would reinforce what Hal said. In the Fuel Assistance Office and in the Economic Services Division, we're also getting calls from clients who are anxious about, A, the level of funding. They hear information on the news about what's happening in Washington. No budget resolution is coming yet. Folks are looking for assistance where there is none at this time until the fuel assistance benefit goes out the door. Right now, we've scheduled a fuel payment directly to certified fuel suppliers on behalf of their clients, and about a little over 22,000 households. At this time, we've got another week and a bit to go for processing. Will have their benefit paid on the evening of November 15th. That's a critical date. It gets us ahead of the opening of crisis fuel assistance at the 5 community action agencies. The Economic Services Division has received close to 40,000 applications for assistance. As of last night, close of business yesterday, we've processed almost 94% of those folks. So we're very much a front-end loaded program. We started taking applications in July, and we've been working through the summer and fall to make sure that folks who are eligible are ready to go when we pay that benefit in the middle of November. But the numbers, as the governor pointed out, are really, really, really tight. 84% of our clients heat with a deliverable petroleum product, oil, propane, or kerosene. And 95% of our benefit dollars go for oil, propane, and kerosene. At those numbers, the overwhelming majority of fuel dealers have a minimum delivery of at least 100 gallons, and some are at 125. Keep in mind those are the averages. So there are folks who are going to get a benefit, but are still going to have to struggle to make up the difference to get a minimum delivery from their fuel dealer. We've got lots of information here and lots of numbers, but I won't burden you with those at this time.
Thank you, Richard. So that's where we are. I'd be happy to answer questions that you might have.
Well, it seems hard to fathom. I mean, Obama's a Democrat. He's your guy. He's born in Hawaii, where it doesn't snow. But is it? How do you explain why his numbers are at least favorable to cold states?
You know, I don't try to understand the ways of Washington. All I can tell you is that the good news, or the better news, is that the continuing resolution that we expect to move forward in Congress soon, we believe will include the Senate number. And that's what the New England governors are going to be pushing hard for as a stopgap measure from total disaster. So what we're saying is we know the Senate budget number gets us to 192 gallons from an average last winter of 262. That's what we governors will be pushing hard for as a first step to rectify the situation.
And what are you willing to do when you say that no Vermonter will freeze? What are you willing to do to ensure that?
I'm going to make sure that regardless of what happens, that Vermonters have adequate heat to stay warm this winter. That's a basic need that must be met. I don't want to pretend that Vermont has the dollars in our pocket, Vermonters have the dollars in our pockets to replace every budget cut being proposed by Washington. I do have confidence that working together with my fellow governors and with our extraordinary congressional delegation, we can make a bad situation into a better situation by at least getting into the Senate number.
It's been suggested, though, that the legislature might be interested in replacing those funds. Would you go along with that?
Well, the question would be replacing what funds?
For federal funds.
From what number?
Back to where they were last year.
From the Obama budget?
Yeah.
You know, I would just suggest to the legislature, if that was really the proposal, that it might be tough to find $11 million, or if they can find $11 million that we haven't seen yet, I'd love to see it. What I'm saying is that we have to send a clear message to Washington that asking cold states to literally have their allocations cut in more than half from last year, when oil has moved from $3.60 a gallon to $4 a gallon, would be an imposition that would be unfair and unwise and tremendously detrimental to our citizens.
Doesn't this happen every year where the president gives a lowball number and then Congress comes in and
You know,
saves the day?
things are a little more critical. I've only been on this job 10 months, but my observation as someone who's watched from the legislature is that this is a more critical situation than we're accustomed to. Usually, we're able to tell Vermonters what benefit they're going to get for the year, for the winter, and give them some assurance that we know what we're talking about and they know what to expect. We're unable to do that this year. So we're literally borrowing over $2 million that we don't really have. We're taking the president's number and we're sending that out right away to get slightly over 100 gallons in everybody's tank. When you're using an average of, as you can see here, 764 gallons is the average used in Vermont, and we're giving assurances for 100 gallons, a little over 100 gallons, you can understand how tough this is for Vermonters. So we've got to be, I think everyone understands in Vermont that Washington is less predictable than it's been in the past, and probably less predictable than in many, many years.
So are any efforts underway, Governor, to get those 84% off of deliverable petroleum products?
Well, sure. I mean, we want to move. Listen, let's talk about what we're doing there. As you know, we're insulating and tightening up the homes of low-income Vermonters every single year, and that's a very successful program. It tends to cut their oil consumption or their heat consumption by about 24%. Every time we do one of those homes, we're making progress. We very much want to see Vermonters move to pellets and other locally grown fuels that are literally half the cost of oil. But we have to find creative ways to get there, because the pellet burners made in Barry are about twice of what an oil burner costs right now. So obviously that's not a transition that you can make in a week or a month.
So is it really just the delay in action by Congress that is creating this uncertainty? You're unable to...
The delay from Washington is creating lots of uncertainty across the board. We're particularly concerned that at this late date that there still seems to be no resolution to this, and we're concerned that the White House didn't reconsider their number. We want to make clear that they, at the urging of the governors, they were, and congressional folks from cold states, they were reconsidering their original number. And it was disappointing for us to learn on Friday that they're sticking with their original recommendation.
Back on the fuel issue for a moment, pellet stoves are considerably cheaper now, where you can get a good pellet stove installed for under $3,000. And I wonder, propane is always significantly higher than oil, or at least historically has been. Has there been much fuel switching going on among this population here? Should that be stepped up? How do you get to that?
Well, let's be clear about what we're talking about. You're right that pellet stoves can be installed for the price that you're talking about. But there's a difference between a pellet stove and a pellet furnace. Furnace obviously heats the whole house. It replaces the oil burner, distributes the heat across the entire building, whereas the stove is a localized heat. The pellet stoves are economical, and we want to encourage those transitions as much as we can. We're hoping that the burners become more economical so that more Vermonters have the capital to make that switch. But again, as part of our energy plan, we think it's an important part of it, but you're not going to get there over. These are Vermonters who have nothing. These folks are making decisions between prescription drugs, food on the table, clothing, and heat. We're not talking about people who have expendable income to put pellet burners in their homes right now.
So if this is about 15% of the fuel that an average family needs over the course of a given year, what can the state really do to help people if it gets desperate? January 1st, there's no, people have already...
We have to get a win in Washington. We have to ensure that the continuing resolution includes the Senate number, which would help us considerably. I think maybe, Richard, you stole some of my sheets, so keep digging. Just so you know, just so you have the math clearly, the Senate budget number would cut us by $2.7 million. That's something that we can sort out in Vermont. We can't sort out $11.7 million. That's the Obama number.
So your best case scenario is the Senate number?
That's what we that's what we governors are going to be pushing for, is the Senate number and the continuing resolution as a first step in solving this problem. Obviously, we want to get it back to last year's funding level, which would still be a cut. I want to make that clear. If you got last year's funding level of Vermont, that's $23 million. It would be a cut because oil is $4 a gallon versus an average of $3.60 last year.
And Richard, you said that you've processed or you've gotten 40,000 applications. Is that right? How does that compare with previous years?
We're running ahead of last year in terms of applications coming in. We're projecting the caseload is going to increase by about 5 to 7%. Some of that we see early on throughout July, August, September, October. But a lot of those new clients come in when they go to community action agencies around the state looking for crisis fuel assistance, and the crisis fuel worker puts all their options on the table and says, do you know about seasonal fuel assistance? Do you know about Three Squares Vermont? Let's find all the different ways we can to help you with your budget. So applications are up. We expect the caseload to be up, and those numbers are factored in here into these totals as well. Fuel prices are up, funding is down, so all the critical numbers are moving in the wrong direction. The last piece of the puzzle is the winter. And if we have a colder than average winter, people are going to be using more than that 764. So there's another unknown in there.
So I think we hit these numbers, but I just want to make sure that you got it in terms of the, I hope I was clear enough. You do realize we got $23 million last year.
And with Obama, it would be 11.7?
11.7, exactly.
And the
So
total under the Senate?
Total under the Senate, it was a $2.7 million cut, so we'd be getting roughly $20 million out of the Senate, a little over $20 million. We can make that work.
Would you be willing to comment on one of those things, proposal to put an end to strikes and work positions?
Yeah, I think that, first I want to say, maybe I've been around a little too long, but there doesn't seem to be a conversation that I haven't been a part of. And back when a senator named Jeb Spalding was heading the Education Committee some years ago in the Senate, we had this conversation. We almost passed a bill that does exactly what the bill that's in the Senate Education Committee does right now, which is basically, find common ground to avoid strikes so that teachers and parents and children aren't put at risk by finding some compromise, which many states have. As you know, Vermont's probably one of 13 states that has the ability to strike, that finds a compromise between taking away the right to strike with the school board's ability to impose contracts. And I think it's a conversation that we should have.
Seemed like a reasonable, balanced
Yes,
change.
it does. It does. And, obviously, I think the answer is yes.
Well, so your evaluation then of the merits of the proposal is, I don't want to put words in your mouth.
I think this is a conversation that the legislature and the administration should have with the education community and the commissioner this winter. There's a bill pending right now in the Senate that finds a compromise by prohibiting strikes, the right to strike, and prohibiting the right of school boards to impose contracts. And that's obviously the compromise that could be found, it seems to me, by both parties or discussed, that might lead us to a better place than we are right now.
Do you think they'll support this kind of legislation, or is it just worth having a conversation about it?
I'm very willing to consider legislation that brings the parties together and finds a compromise that avoids kids being out of school for 9 days or more.
The teachers don't seem to think very much of this idea. It was described as an assault on collective bargaining. How do you bring them along?
That's why I'm saying I think if we brought all the parties together, we would find that we could find compromise on both sides, as negotiators did in Bennington, that would bring the parties together. I recall that when this conversation was had some years ago, my recollection is actually that the teachers were supportive of the legislation and the school boards weren't. And I believe that's what kept it from becoming law. So I think there's some giving and taking to do on both sides. I think it's an area where we should try to find common ground.
Yesterday, the report came out on the healthcare respective spending. And did any of these numbers surprise you? I mean, do you think that the idea that we're going to be spending something close to $10 billion a year on healthcare, either way, either with your plan or the legislature's plan, or with somehow totally scrapped, what do you make of that?
As I've said before, I don't think that there's a bigger way to continue to kick the middle class in the teeth or to continue to find impediments to job growth and economic opportunity than the threat of the rising cost of health care in America and the rising cost of health care in Vermont. We spend more money than any other country in the world on health care for outcomes that are often not as good. And what I find astonishing is that many of the other governors in Congress doesn't see this as big a problem as I do. As a business person, I can tell you that trying to provide health coverage to employees, which every employer in Vermont wants to do, in an environment where you're getting 10, 20, 30% increases in health insurance premiums, where we're all buying more and more, spending more and more on insurance for less and less coverage and asking employees to pay more and more. This is the single economic ingredient that is going to stifle job growth and stifle the incomes of Vermonters to expand and grow and find better times ahead. So we've got to get costs under control. I believe our proposal does that. It's bold, it's smart, and it's extraordinarily necessary for job growth.
We surprised though that there wasn't more daylight between the projected cost of Green Mountain Care versus they do nothing?
Well, I actually saw quite a bit of daylight. I mean, by 2020, 2019, you're talking about $8 billion roughly versus $10 billion. You know, $1 billion, last time I checked, that's 1,000 million. If we can save a couple of those, we will have a competitive edge over the other states. And all I can tell you is, I do not, every day I recognize as governor that my biggest challenge is that Vermonters on average are making the same amount of money that they were making a decade ago in a state where suddenly fuel prices, oil is $4 a gallon, groceries are up, expenses are up, and incomes are stagnant. And if you're asking healthcare to eat up 2 to 3 times income growth for Vermonters, it's a recipe for economic disaster. So it's going to take some courage and some boldness to find a way out of this, but I still say, if Vermont can find a way to save $2 billion a year for every single Vermonter by 2020, and much of it before then, we get the jobs, we get the economic growth, and we get the middle class who's actually recovering from tough economic times.
That was more than the best case scenario, though. That was outlined by Commissioner Kimball yesterday. It could be just $500 million, which we pointed out is not chump change, but it's 5%.
All I can tell you is I always ask this question. When people say, your plan isn't ambitious enough, I say, what's yours? And what do we do if we stick with the status quo? If we stick with the status quo, we will bankrupt small business, and we will continue to bankrupt the middle class. The gap between the top 1% and the rest of the 99% of Americans continues to grow. It's no different in Vermont. And if we allow healthcare costs to eat up our disposable income, it's a recipe for economic disaster. So it's one of the tough things that we need to get done in Vermont to have a competitive advantage over the other 49 states. And I am optimistic about the board's ability to deliver a system that will save us money and deliver better quality with better outcomes to Vermonters.
What Democrat do you like in the Burlington mayoral race?
I like them all. I think it's a great group of candidates.
Make an endorsement?
I'm endorsing them all.
You don't have to.
You know, I'm serious. I think it's impressive that in this little state of Vermont, where we have such a healthy democracy, that you have so many qualified candidates running for mayor. And I think we should feel blessed that we have lots of people interested in a tough job at a tough time for the city of Burlington, and I wish them all my very best.
But you won't make an endorsement
No.
before the caucus?
If your old friend Tim Nash.
I got a lot of old friends running for mayor, and it's hard to choose among them. I really do think they'd all make great mayors.
Earlier this week, you talked about repair costs being dramatically different.
When you try to get the cap lifted in Washington, do you think the fact that you're asking for less money, a lot less money, makes your case better or worse?
I think it makes it easier, to be honest with you. In fact, I had this conversation with Congressman Welch, who has the toughest lift to do, because as you know, Senator Leahy did an extraordinary job of getting the amendment through the Senate yesterday, and Senator Sanders was helpful in pushing it along, that gets everything to Vermont that we so badly need. And Congressman Welch is dealing with a more difficult group in the House. And I asked him on Saturday when I saw him, does this help or hurt? He said, a smaller number is always easier to get than a bigger number, so it helps.
You don't think they're going to look at it and say, you can take care of this problem?
I doubt it. This is still a significant problem. When you're asking a small state like Vermont to come up with tens of millions of dollars that, as a result of a natural disaster, the precedent in Washington has always been, we're here to help. Hey, we're going to stay till you drop. Thanks for having us.